I need to put the issue of the relationship between the US and Egypt and US policy towards the Egyptian uprising. I don't like to call it the Arab Spring, or I don't like to call it certainly not a revolution, but I need to put it in the context of US policy in general right now. I think what the two previous speakers, Stefan and Ivan, said about the European Union being in many ways a bystander to what's happening, it's equally true about the United States. The United States really is a bystander to what has been happening. And I think it's likely to remain a bystander because the United States has lost a lot of the instruments that made it a major player in all sorts of the situation around the world, with one exception, which is very dangerous, because the United States still has the military capacity to intervene and to bring about decisive changes. Decisive does not necessarily mean good changes. They brought about a decisive change in Iraq, for better or for I won't even say for better or for worse. And that capacity still remains. But in general, the United States has lost a lot of its instruments. It has lost the capacity to influence countries economically, the points that you made about the European Union. It's even more so in the case of the United States. The United States is going through a period of what I would call self-inflicted poverty, in terms of the taxation policy it has pursued, the attempt to cut back the deficit without increasing taxes in a substantial manner, which means that there is literally no money left in the budget for foreign assistance. The amounts keep on going down. And I mean, this is a policy decision. It's not an, absolute poverty, essentially, but the fact is the problem remains. And the United States, and particularly in the Arab world, has lost any kind of moral authority. I'm sure that you are all familiar with the opinion surveys that show how Arabs look at the United States, and you know that there is certainly not much moral authority left. At the same time, what you have in the Arab world is a continued, for reasons that I don't quite understand myself, there is a continued, totally exaggerated expectation about what the United States can do. In other words, you have this loss of influence by the United States, but the expectation of the United States have not changed. The United States is still expected to solve all the problems of the area. You go to the Gulf, you talk to the countries of the Gulf, and they want the United States to deal with Iran for them. You want, no matter what, the United States is always expected to bring a solution, which means essentially it can never do anything right. Now, more specifically, the other changes that are important to understand what the United States, how the United States has been dealing with Egypt, is the fact that there is no longer a framework to the US foreign policy. The framework of US foreign policy was the Cold War framework. And after the end of the Cold War, there has been no other overriding concept of US foreign policy that has replaced. There is a sort of hankering for the Cold War, because the Cold War at least gave some certainty in terms of what US policy should do. And I think sometimes this idea of the pivot to Asia that the Obama administration has been pushing is essentially an attempt to restore a vision of the world as a bipolar world. Here is China and here is the United States, and we have to deal with this problem. We have to deal with the growing influence of China the way in the past we dealt with the Soviet Union. There is kind of a certainty. You go back to well-known territory over that you have crossed earlier, because and this is the last point before I come to Egypt. Because there is no overall framework, I think what you see accentuated in this time in the United States is the conflict that has always been there, at times in a more latent form, at times very explicitly, between a foreign policy which is based on state interest and a foreign policy that is based on values. Is the United States, trying to protect its own interest, or it's the United States trying to reform the world, essentially? And in this case, it translates into bringing, sort of promoting democracies in other countries. And I think that conflict, it's very, very clear. Now, the presence of the Soviet Union, the bipolar world, essentially, was ensured that in most of the time, it was state interest that prevailed, that the more idealistic vision of transforming the world really took second place in relation to state interest, hence the long history of the United States of supporting dictatorial regimes, because they were on the right side of the Cold War divide, essentially. And now the whole issue is becoming more difficult for the United States to manage. Okay, let me come to, all that said, let me come to the case of Egypt. Very briefly, in terms of background, Egypt is the country that Egypt is the country that the United States had lost to the Soviet Union, and it got back with Sadat. It got back in the 70s. And it got back, if you want, in spades, because not only because Egypt again allied with the West rather than allied with the Soviet Union, but also Egypt went all the way to signing the Camp David Agreement. So that essentially this is the country that came back to the fold, if you want. And the United States, therefore, put a lot of emphasis on that area, on the relationship with Egypt. Add to it the fact that there is still this vision, which was true in the past, I think it's less and less true, that Egypt is the largest country in the Middle East, and that has not changed. In fact, it's becoming bigger and bigger, but also it's the most influential country in the Arab world, which is, I think, an idea which is very much open to discussion at this point, how much influence Egypt really has. Egyptians still think of themselves as the trendsetters. I really have serious doubts that this is any longer the situation. But as a result of this idea, the fact that this is the prodigal son, essentially, that came back to the fold, and the perceived importance of, the perceived influence of Egypt in the region, the United States put a lot of emphasis on the relation, and Camp David, the United States put a lot of emphasis on this. And essentially the relationship between the United States and Egypt coast along without much change in the Mubarak years. Mubarak is a great disappointment to the United States. Sadat had a vision of what he was trying to do. He had a vision of transformation of Egypt. Whether he would have ever been able to implement it, that's a different issue. We all know he was assassinated, and we never found out whether he would have been able to continue. But certainly he had a vision of transformation. Mubarak had no vision, essentially. Mubarak spent 30 years trying to keep things from happening, I would say, rather than making things happen. Try to keep, don't rock the boat, don't keep things stable, and don't do very much. The United States was not happy with that relation, but it was not an offensive relation at the same time. One thing that I don't know, because I really have not been able to find any information on this, is whether towards the end of the Mubarak era, the United States was getting worried or not about the stability of Egypt. Officially, it was not. What I don't know is how much the alarm was being raised by by intelligence agencies, essentially, or even by the diplomats in Cairo, about what was the growing unrest in the country. Because the uprising of January 2011 did not come out of nowhere. It came after 3 or 4 years of increasing unrest in the country, increasing labor strikes, increasing little demonstration tensions, none of which in itself, with the exclusion perhaps of the big strike in the textile factory in Malhala al-Kubra, none of these episodes really was very big in itself, but they were incessant, one after the other, which clearly pointed to the fact that there was a lot of unrest in the country. I have not been able to figure out whether the State Department was worried about what was going on here, whether there was an alarm about this situation. What we know for sure is when the uprising starts on January 25th, the first position of the United States is to fly to the defense of Mubarak. There are statements made by Hillary Clinton to the effect that Mubarak is a good ally and that we consider the country stable. And she dispatches a previous ambassador, Frank Wisner, who had been ambassador to Cairo, to Egypt earlier, who goes with a very reassuring message, we are behind you and so on. Within a matter of days, the United States changes its position. And Obama starts saying what he should never have said, in my opinion, that is, Mubarak must go. And the reason why I'm saying that in the United States, Obama should never have said that, it's not the same way he should never have said Assad must go. It's not up to the United States to decide who must go and who must stay. What he should have said, the Egyptian people seem to want Mubarak to go, which was a fact. So, but it's not, this is an Egyptian opinion, it's not the opinion of the United States. So that there is this very quick change on the part of the United States, which in turn will cause endless problems in the relationship between the United States and particularly the Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia is absolutely incensed because they read it very much in their own terms. Essentially, it's, if Saudi Arabia gets into trouble, the United States is not going to stand behind the royal family, essentially. They dropped Mubarak. Who is the next one that's going to be dropped by the United States if there is trouble? It's a bit the same when, right after the invasion in 2003, like right after the invasion of Iraq, the question that I got whenever I traveled in the Arab world is, who is next? There was this general expectation that the United States would be invading other countries, deposing other regimes. And what we got after the US decided not to back Mubarak is, who is the next person that the United States is going to drop, essentially? Who is going to be abandoned? So there is this change in the position of the United States. And the United States at this point decides to, it's one case in which the United States clearly decides to align its foreign policy with values rather than with state interest. In other words, it decides that the policy of the United States really has to be influenced or dictated by support for democratic processes. So that the United States drops Mubarak and embraces the idea of democracy in Egypt. Embraces the election, it embraces the whole project, always as a spectator, because the United States really does not have much influence in that entire process. But it supports the democratic process, at least in the terms of the elections. And once the elections take place, the United States decides to accept the election results. Now, there has been a huge misunderstanding in Egypt that the United States wanted the Muslim Brothers to win the elections. The United States did not want the Muslim Brothers to win the election. The United States had the vague hope that liberals would win the elections. The problem is that the so-called liberal parties, the parties that I never know what to call, because if you call them secular parties, they say, no, we are not secular, because that sounds we are atheist. If you call them liberal, it's it's a total misnomer because these are not liberal parties, essentially. But the parties other than the Muslim Brothers were hopeless in terms of their capacity to organize, their capacity to get votes, their capacity to go out and talk to people, and so on and so forth. So that in the end, it is the Muslim Brothers who win the election, together with the Salafi and Noor party, and the United States decides to do what it had not done. Oh boy, it's taking me longer than I thought. That's it. Okay, yeah, I finally got it. Sorry, I tried to move faster. The United States decides to accept the election, contrary to what had done in 2006. In Palestine, when Hamas won the election, the United States essentially disowned Hamas. Fast forward to then the crisis of 2013. The United States, through the summer of the summer of 2012 and the fall of 2012 and early 2013 was putting pressure on Egypt to have another parliamentary election, essentially, which is, and if you remember, that election had even been scheduled by Morsi for April of 2013. It never took place because essentially the parties that I don't know what to call, the secular parties, knew that they would lose the election again. They did not want to go up against the Muslim Brotherhood another time, and as a result, the election law was blocked several times. The Supreme Court kept on sending it back to the government for more revisions. In one of those endless situations where they ask for a set of revisions, the law goes back to them, then they ask for a different set of revisions, and so on. Clearly they were blocking the election. The United States, until the end, puts pressure on Ann Patterson, the US ambassador, puts pressure on Egypt to move towards election and to try to solve the problem that way. On the eve of the elections, on the eve of the coup d'etat, the United States is still trying to convince the military not to intervene, but or at least to intervene only to force a new presidential election. That is not to seize power, but to force a new presidential election. And that's clearly the United States fails completely, and since then the United States has not been able to make up its mind what its policy in Egypt should be. And there are three factors that are influenced that policy in Egypt. One is, originally it's the democracy issue. It was a coup d'etat that took place. According to the United States law, the US has to suspend aid to a country where a democratically elected government is deposed in a coup d'etat. The United States never said that it was not a coup d'etat, but it never said that it was a coup d'etat either. There is a ruling by the lawyers at the State Department that says the law does not require us to decide whether it's a coup. So we are not saying it's a coup, we are not saying that it's not a coup. So there is this greatly ambiguous policy that the United States pursues. It suspends the delivery of Apache's helicopters and some other material, but there is never a real suspension of aid. So there is that, there is the policy based on democracy. There is a second aspect of the policy which is really very much influenced by the Israel factor. That is that Al-Sisi is very much cooperating with the Israeli government in terms of the security in Sinai, in terms of Hamas. What's happening in Rafah now with the essentially destruction of much of the town in order to keep to prevent the building of more tunnels essentially from the Gaza Strip into Egypt. it's very clear sign of the cooperation with Israel, and the Israeli government will tell you very explicitly that they are now lobbying for Egypt in Washington. In other words, the Israeli government has become part of not only is lobbying for Israel, but is also lobbying for Egypt in the sense of keeping American support for Egypt. And finally, there is the third factor, the other factor that has come up now, that is the ISIS factor. The terror, and I'm using ISIS in the broad sense, the terrorism factor, the Islamic extremism factor, and particularly since Ansar Bekt al-Makdisi decided that they declared their allegiance to ISIS, whatever that means, because I don't think they're now operationally integrated, but certainly it's a declaration of, general orientation. That issue has become paramount to the United States policy towards Egypt. So it seemed to me that now the way these elements are combining, that Egypt is going to maintain the support of the United States. It's up to Egypt to lose it. And the one place where it could lose it is by extreme human rights violations. When was it, last week, 2 weeks ago, when there was a discussion of the human rights report on Egypt at the United Nations in Geneva, the United States did join the attacks on Egypt on this, because I think that report, what came out in the report was so extreme that the United States could not overlook it, despite its willingness to maintain good relations. Now, that said, and this is my last comment, how important is the position that the United States is taking on Egypt, its relation to Egypt in terms of what actually happened in Egypt? And I would actually argue that what the United States is doing really does not have much impact on what's happening in Egypt. That what the United States is doing has a big impact on its own relation to Egypt and its own relation to other countries of the Middle East. How the United States is dealing with Egypt has an impact to the relations that Egypt has, particularly with Saudi Arabia, for example. But it's not really important of what is happening in Egypt. The idea that somehow the United States can have an impact on how Sisi deals with the opposition, how Sisi deals with the Muslim Brotherhood or with anybody else, it's totally wrong. But I think what the US does has a big impact on how Arab countries are looking at Egypt, at the United States now.